Exciting.
Here we are.
I can't wait. Here we go. Oh, it's setting it up. I don't know what that means. Okay. All right, let's see. Dun, dun, dun. It's still setting it up. Okay. Well, oh, there we go. Okay, we're up. We're up on YouTube. Oh, it's setting it up. I don't know what that means. Oh, I was live the whole time I was saying that. Oh my gosh. YouTube doing me dirty here. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone, whether you're here in person in the parish hall or joining us live on YouTube. I am so glad that you're here, however you are here. This is a really special event. I'm really excited to be joined today by the Reverend Dr. Dan Inman, who is the Chancellor of Chichester Cathedral in England. He's told me I'm allowed to call him Dan during this conversation, so we're on a first name basis, I guess, which is good. So I'm excited to have him here, especially the Sunday after Easter. That's usually when clergy are trying to find some downtime, and yet here he is on Zoom. But in what time of the day is it there for you, Dan?
It's almost tea time, Cameron. It's 3:14. So yeah, I've got the cake lined up all ready for further Easter feasting afterwards.
Perfect. Well, can y'all who are here in the room, can y'all hear him okay? Because I can turn up the volume slightly before we get going. Okay, perfect. I see some thumbs up. That's good. That's a good sign. So how this is going to go today, I'm going to let Dan introduce himself here in just a moment and tell us a little bit about himself. Also, maybe a fun fact. Give us some kind of fun. What do you like to do for fun? I don't know. And also maybe tell us what exactly a chancellor does, and then after that we'll dive in and start talking about our church's patron saint, Saint Richard, and learn a bit about him and his life, why he became a saint, and what maybe his witness has to say to us today. So all right, so with that, Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, thank you, Cameron. Well, first of all, I guess happy Easter to everybody, and a sort of belated happy feast day, St. Richard's Day, to you all as well. Yes, I'm Chancellor and Residentiary Canon here at Chichester Cathedral, and I've been in this post now for just over a year and a half, which is a strange year, as Cameron also knows, in which to begin a ministry. Although I come from this part of the world in England, just down the coast on Hayling Island, and prior to this, I worked for the Bishop of Chichester as his Director of Ordinands, and before that was in Oxford for some time as a chaplain and at one of the Oxford colleges. So yeah, I've been down in Sussex now for 4 or 5 years. Yeah, it's going quickly. But I was trying to think of fun facts and thinking of fun things you'd like to do, and I was just reflecting on the fact that actually I haven't really done anything fun for the past year. I've sort of I've taken up gardening with some alacrity, but I'm not quite sure that is particularly quirky. But yes, I now sort of have detailed knowledge about different types of daffodils. So.
Well, regardless, though, I think that's definitely living up to our expectation of what the Chancellor of Chichester Cathedral would do for fun. And as someone who's been watching a significant amount of Monty Don during the pandemic,
good.
I'm grateful. So,
good.
Well, good. Well, and what exactly does a Chancellor do? What is your role there at the Cathedral?
Well, the title of Chancellor, along with that of Precentor and Treasurer and Dean, I suppose, go right back to the Middle Ages, to the foundation of these cathedrals. And originally, the Chancellor would have had responsibility for teaching, would have been a bit like a grammar school master. And then, of course, we had our own school attached to the cathedral, so and also had plenty of other clergy here back before the Reformation who would have done a lot of the day-to-day legwork. So that translates now to me having a responsibility in the cathedral for education and for teaching, and so part of my role is helping to nurture the theological life of the cathedral and of the diocese on behalf of the bishop. And Alongside that, I take my share as a residentiary canon. So week after week, I'll have my duties of leading the offices and presiding at the Eucharist and so on, and taking a share in the governance of the cathedral and chapter, alongside my duties in the city with the university and so on. So it's a really interesting role, not one which has been totally reshaped by the pandemic, I think. Which has had its great pains and griefs alongside it, but it's forced all of us really to think, what is a cathedral for in the 21st century? And perhaps we'll come on to that again a bit later with St. Richard.
Yes, yeah. Well, thanks for sharing. And for those who are in this room, a chapter is like a cathedral's version of a vestry. Okay, so when he's talking about the chapter. Well, thank you for being here again. I mean, this is really delightful to have you.
It's a lovely link to have. Yeah.
Yeah, and there is, before we move on to St. Richard, you do have a Central Texas connection to our friend Bertie Pearson, who's the rector of Grace in Georgetown. Yeah.
Yes, we were at college together. So when he was on exchange here some time ago. So I haven't been to Texas since I was a small boy. I think I did go to Houston once. We had some family in Houston, I think. But anyway, yeah, it's a long time since I've been in the South. But
well, once we're on the other side of this, you'll have to actually come over and visit.
That'd be nice.
And yeah, we'd be happy.
And some of your congregation have been to Chichester. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. That's true. Yes. In fact, actually, I know a couple of people who are in here who went on that trip to Chichester, and there's some pictures of that trip here and here. Right. I see Tom Cooper in the background who took those photos. So yeah. So there's some
welcome back.
Yeah. All right. Well, okay, great. Let's get started. So tell us a little bit about St. Richard, about just a brief overview of his life, and maybe help situate him historically for us. What was going on in his time?
Yeah, I mean, he arrives on the scene, I suppose, in English church life, but at a time of renewal. This is not so long, I suppose, after Thomas Becket has been brutally murdered at Canterbury, and there's still that sort of ongoing struggle between the church and the king at the time, and that certainly shapes church and royal relationships to some degree. And at the time too, that the church is experiencing a sort of renewed focus upon discipline and mission, and renewed desire to teach people the faith, to help them prepare appropriately to receive the sacraments, and to strengthen the parish system, which really is not that old by this point in English life. It takes about 300, 400 years for the parish system to emerge in England, and it's pretty much all over the place in some sense in terms of how it's disciplined. And if you come to Chichester now, Chichester is at the far west end of the of West Sussex, of the traditional county of Sussex, which stretches along from near to Portsmouth all the way to Kent. So it's quite a long diocese, and even today it's an absolute nightmare to try and get to the eastern end of the diocese. It's partly the terrible train service on the south coast of England, which sort of chunters along. But when it comes to administering a diocese in the 13th century, that's all the more challenging. So it's alongside that, alongside a sort of strengthening of the role of bishops, you have the mendicant orders, religious orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, who are also a fairly new development within the life of the Western Catholic Church, Western Latin Rite. And they, of course, are really important forces for sharing the faith, for ministering to the poor, for preaching and teaching, and for healthcare, effectively. So these are important institutions alongside the parish system, I suppose. This is the source of the church into which Richard is, to which he is born. He's not actually from Sussex. he was he's actually, you might have heard, he's called Richard of Wich, sometimes referred to as that, Wych, and that refers to what is now a town in the Black Country in the middle of the England called Droitwich.
Okay.
He was from a rural stock. I think we didn't actually know a huge amount about his childhood. What we do know about Richard is derived from a record of his life written by his confessor, Ralph Bocking, after he died. And we know that from him that he went on from his early education to study at what he calls a studium generale. So that's an early university. So it's probably Oxford.
Okay.
So that's sort of the key turning point, I suppose, in a sense, because it's there where he makes his key connections both with the church and learning the faith, and learning theology, but also comes into contact with Edmund of Abingdon, who goes on to become Archbishop of Canterbury. And this connection, Oxford at that time didn't have colleges, so you would have gone up to the university and would have gained a master who would have prepared you in grammar and rhetoric, and so on. He comes to the attention in due course of Edmund, not least because he becomes Chancellor of the university in 1235. Edmund sort of picks up on this bright young thing. Young thing is probably in his 40s by that point, but is that then a young thing, a very young thing, and is nabbed for service at the Archbishop's court in Canterbury.
So this is the 1200s. This would be, what was Richard? You said he was from rural stock. Was he of a kind of lower class background, or did he, what was, talk a little bit about his family life and how he would have come to go to Oxford at that time?
Yeah, there's a certain sort of myth which implies that he was impoverished, and actually what we do know is not entirely clear. The title of his parents, from what I think the historians say, implies an aristocratic, or certainly a well-to-do family which had land. So he wasn't a peasant or a serf, and of course if you were a serf, you're not going to find yourself going up to Oxford. So the sort of the idealized version of Richard as a impoverished young chap. He's not from a wealthy stock. He's not, because he's obviously struggling for cash once he's made Bishop of Chichester, but nonetheless, he must have been from a fairly well-to-do family, but I think it's a sense in which he once he's left home, and finds himself very much in the court of the Archbishop, any sense of those ongoing connections would have been, I suppose, fairly tenuous to Droitwich, but he has got family members who become part of his own entourage, and who are operating in the Diocese of Chichester in due course. So, which also perhaps implies, he wasn't just sort of freakishly academic, but from poor stock. That they are a family who can get on in the life of 13th century England.
Gotcha. So say a little bit too about you mentioned the parish system had not quite come into view quite yet, but talk a little bit, if you could, about the context of the church in particular at this time, and how would Richard have ended up becoming the Bishop of Chichester? What was the process? How would have that happened?
Well, he's after let me jump back a bit. So as he joins Edmund's court, he finds himself traveling with Edmund to the continent, and this is long before Brexit, when very much England is embedded into the life of continental Europe with the church, and so he finds himself accompanying him on his travels in France, where Edmund dies, and he accompanies his body to Pontigny, to the abbey there, and for burial. But at this point, it's a bit hazy, the background about what then happens. The suggestion is that he goes to Orleans and to the Dominicans orders there and prepares for the priesthood. And there's a bit of a gap there in terms of, what was he doing in that time? He's ordained priest, and he's obviously given theological and spiritual formation. And almost as though, he could have found himself lodged within the Dominican order and their workings across Europe at that point. But he's called back because Edmund's successor, Boniface of Savoy, decides to elect him as the successor to Ralph Neville in 1244 as Bishop of Chichester. And this isn't a surprise. He's a very senior official at this point as Chancellor in the province of Canterbury, which was a bit like Chief of Staff really to the Archbishop of Canterbury. So he was pretty high caliber. But this didn't please Henry III, who presumed to have some kind of veto over those who were appointed, and was already smarting from the fact that one of his other flunkies had not been successfully made Bishop of Winchester. So he's quite keen to use the opportunity to fill the see of Chichester with his own man, Robert Paslew. So there's a bit of a standoff, to be honest, and it means that Richard ends up having to sort of travel, and I should say Boniface, the Archbishop, he arrives in 1244, makes all these appointments, and then clears off back to Savoy in the continent. So for another 4 or 5 years. So these battles can't be sort of fought out in Whitehall in London. It's a sense of a sort of suspended animation, really, like who is the Bishop of Chichester? The bishop wants this man, the Pope wants this man. So Richard, naturally enough, seeks out the Pope's opinion and goes to Lyon, where the Pope was then based, and then Innocent IV confirms him as and consecrates him as Bishop of Chichester in March 1245. So a good year after his initial appointments by the Archbishop, so at this point Henry III is sort of rather stymied. He's got to accept it, but Richard comes back to England and to Sussex, but not to be completely outmanoeuvred. The king denies Richard all of his what are called temporalities. That is the kind of physical and financial assets which would be due to the Bishop of Chichester. So he's denied his palace down the road here, and he can't sort of come into possession of the cathedral properly, because it's all part of the same complex here in Chichester, and very much in medieval Chichester, this would have been the bishop's episcopal quarter. In fact, we're one of only 2 or 3 cathedrals left in England now where the bishop's palace is still joined to the cathedral in that way. I mean, the whole quarter of the cathedral is still owned by the Church of England, which goes back to the Conqueror's establishment of the cathedral here and giving of lands to the church. So Richard was denied all of that, and so he finds himself, on the hoof, really, trying to find his own way around the diocese, but without much cash in the back of his pocket. So it kind of it's not totally dissimilar to some of the battles which were going on a century earlier with Becket in the previous century, and Henry II. Again, this kind of who rules the church in England. I mean, of course, that will be an ongoing source of tension until 1534, yes, of which we are the inheritors of that particular argument being settled in a particular way.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, say a little bit more about that too, about the church's relationship at the time with sort of civil authority, because I think this is all, pre-English Reformation. We are all at least, nominally familiar with Henry VIII and a sort of narrative about his wives and what happened there, that sort of kickstarted what became
Sorry, that's my dog going wild.
Oh, no.
The postman's
Oh,
just
there it is. Yes. Well, I mentioned Henry VIII, and the dog just it was too much.
Yeah.
But yeah, say a little bit about the relationship between the church and civil authority at the time, and how those things were intertwined, how those things may have been in conflict. I mean, you've already hinted at that a little bit with the way that Richard was kind of boxed out of his the palace and the knights. I don't know, guys. I feel like our next campaign we should think about the palace idea. I don't know, but no, I think talk about that. What was the tension like there at the time?
Well, I mean, it sort of comes about really because it's to do with just political influence, and the church, unlike today, or even nearly as much in the 16th century, although that seems a world away from where we are now. The clergy were the educated class alongside lawyers and court officials, and wielded enormous influence over everyday life, economically, socially. I know it's not just a sort of private religious, what you do on a Sunday. Bishops in the English church are senior figures at the English court. And even up until Henry VIII's time, of course, you have clergy playing occupying very senior, what you would think was quite civic roles over the life of the kingdom. So whether that's Lord Chancellor or it would be the obvious example where many Lord Chancellors are clergy during this period. So it's. And of course, the church controls education, broadly speaking. So, who occupies the English sees, the English dioceses, bishops, are very significant appointments. And of course, up until about 10 years ago, that this was still a matter for Downing Street. It's still the Queen who approves bishops in the church in England, but the names which are sent forward to Her Majesty are now discerned by a senior ecclesiastical committee. But until quite recently, there would have been the Prime Minister's appointment secretary, who would have often played quite an influential role in appointments, even so much so that certainly in Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair both vetoed quite significant appointments and sent back the names to the appointments committee until they got the names they wanted. So that sort of link between church and state, which of course most of Europe has cast off quite decisively, we still retain in some form. But in terms of how the church, I mean, the parish system was the basic fabric of society, and the church was the key vehicle for that. In any given town, because that they were the source of education, and also managed hospitals such as they existed out of monastic houses and so on. So they're very, very important figures, and of course, and own lots of cash. So because they take tithes. So if you want follow the money, I suppose, in a sense. But that when it comes to getting good positions for your mates, you in political life, you will look to episcopal appointments as an obvious way to exercise your own influence as king.
Fascinating. Yeah, so obviously, can you imagine if like the governor or the president chose Bishop Doyle? How that would be? We just elect them here, like most things in America, and we argue about it before and I'll gather in a large room and cast votes. Well, so tell us a little bit about what made Saint Richard a saint. How did that happen? Because he became a saint actually pretty, if I'm remembering this correctly, not long after his death, actually.
No, it's pretty rapid. I mean, I suppose that's I don't know whether that process was more rapid or less rapid than it would be today. I suppose someone like John Paul II has been canonized pretty quickly, but yes, Richard finds himself being canonized sort of within 10 years of his death, and sort of no, even less than that, sort of 9 years after his death in 1262. So it was clear that this wasn't just he was well remembered as he's died, and is a very popular figure. And of course, miracles are largely one of the key means by which a person is deemed to be holy, and miracles which are performed after their death as well. And that was probably one of the key motivations for a sort of mass movement towards urging his canonization. So it was miracles which happened at his tomb here in the cathedral, in the chapel which he built on the north side of the cathedral, which was dedicated to St. Edmund of Rich, Edmund of Abingdon, his mentor. But there's a question there, isn't there, about why people went to pray at his shrine in the first place? Why was he considered to be so significant? Because he wasn't bishop for terribly long. It's under 10 years, really. And I think that really goes back to the difficulty with which he found himself when he came back from France, where he is denied all his assets. So he goes to Tarring, which is a small town just down the road in Worthing, probably about 20, 30 miles east. And he lodges with the vicar there. But because he hasn't got a sort of seat, as it were, he finds himself being quite a peripatetic character. And also because he wasn't very welcome at court. So whereas it would have been the temptation of many bishops, actually well up until the 19th century, not arguably still today when they spend a lot of time in the House of Lords, he spent lots of time on foot in the diocese, meeting his clergy, meeting his people, and sharing in their poverty as far as they could experience it. Rather than being a distant figure exercising authority from his palace in Chichester, this was a bishop who was present and as the stories relate, deeply loving and caring, but also, I think it's fair to say, quite the disciplinarian, which is also an interesting facet of his character, and interesting that he should then be so revered. But he brings a great deal of order to some of the chaos which related to clergy lives at that point. It's interesting that he has to set down and make it clear to them that it's not actually appropriate for clergy to own concubines, which you wouldn't thought celibate clergy needs to be reminded of this, but perhaps it does tell you something of the state of the English clergy at that point. And it's not just Richard who is committed to that. Richard's trying to fulfill the desires of the Lateran councils at the end of the previous century, and in 1215, the third and fourth Lateran councils, which are precisely aimed at trying to improve the discipline and order of the church. So making sure that the clergy are disciplined and are doing their job, are diligent in teaching and in administering the sacraments with appropriate reverence and holiness, which I imagine if in many parishes they must be glad that suddenly the bishop was actually forcing their clergy to do some work, perhaps, rather than just live off the spoils of the land. But I'm making huge stereotypes about the clergy of the 13th century now, which is very unfair, I suspect. But he does also make sure that the clergy are well looked after as well. Mm-hmm. So there's a sort of extensive building program in what was actually a very poor diocese at the time. This wasn't the wealthiest part of medieval England, because it was quite poor soil. So if you visit Sussex, you'll find that actually a lot of the churches are still basically Saxon, because there wasn't the cash here in the Middle Ages to rebuild them. Whereas if you go to Norfolk or Suffolk in the Great Wall country, and where agriculture is a lot wealthier, you see these magnificent churches all over the place. It's a total nightmare for the diocese now trying to look after these amazing buildings. But what was I saying? Sorry, going off, rattling off. But he sort of brings some order to the way in which the clergy are actually properly housed, and also encourages all parishioners to pay what became known as Richard's pence, which was a small tithe which they would have made towards the cathedral and towards its extension. And Richard, and it wasn't a pretty poor state. It burnt down twice by the point that Richard becomes bishop during the 12th century. And so he really invests in expanding and building new chapels, including the one in which he's finally buried. So he's how do I sum that up? He was a person who was present to his people, and made the best of a bad situation, I suppose, in terms of renewing the order and holiness of his clergy.
Yeah, I would say if it has to be stipulated that you can't keep concubines. There's probably there's a gap in holiness there that you probably need to make up.
Yeah, indeed.
Well,
yeah.
What's fascinating in hearing you talk about that is actually, it sounds like, what Richard was doing is really, at least what I would consider now to be kind of the function of the bishop, right? To travel around from congregation to congregation, to spend time with clergy, to help support them and that sort of thing. But it sounds like, Richard was notable for doing that. So that, how common was it for bishops to actually visit their parishes and things like that? Was it, would Richard have been kind of an outlier in that way?
I think perhaps it's not to claim that clergy had no interest in their diocese. And there are visitation records of bishops in this period. I should say I'm a 19th century church historian. It's always a cop out from historians say it's not my period. but there are plenty of visitations which go on. But it's I suppose it's something which is particularly striking about Richard is that he has to do it, and perhaps there's something a bit of sort of anti-establishment quality to him, because he's been he can't occupy the role which was his by right, and I just wonder whether people particularly warm to that, in the sense of someone who was not in favour with the king, who therefore becomes in favour with the people as a sort of person whom they cherish and sort of take under their wing. And there's something interesting there, isn't there, I suppose, spiritually about, which goes right to the heart of bishops being servants of the servants of God. That they're there to model Christ-like servant ministry. And Richard, by circumstance, but I think also by instinct, desires to model this ministry very effectively. And of course, he is shaped by the Dominicans, who, as an order, are a mendicant order, which means they didn't sort of stay within their monastery like the Benedictines, but they went out and about and sought to renew the church by going beyond the monastery walls and teaching in the parishes. If that was really formative for his own ministry, then I suspect that's that also shaped how he saw himself as a bishop. And he very much favoured the Dominicans during his own time as bishop. So was obviously very keen to see a sort of renewal of apostolic vigour in the life of the church. And perhaps there's always a temptation there, isn't there? Once you sort of establish the parish system, you've got your parish church, you've got your tithes, you've got your vicarage. It can all feel quite sort of sedate and everything's provided. The church, all is well and good. And I suppose that's a bit of a prodding there for Richard to say, actually, that the task of renewal and holiness is incumbent upon all of us, and it requires each one of us to be renewed in our fidelity to Jesus Christ and to his servant ministry.
Yeah, the Son of Man had no place to lay his head, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned a little bit earlier in talking about St. Richard's life, you talked about some of the miracles that were performed, not just that were attributed to him in life, maybe, but also ones that happened after his death. Could you tell us some stories about those? Like, what are some of those miracles, and what did he become famous for in that sense?
Yeah, well, I suppose the the two most famous during his lifetime are that of the chalice, which I imagine most of you all know about there, which actually he normally is pictured with a chalice, isn't he? I don't know whether you have any.
Yeah, that's in our window in there. If you go and look inside the narthex of the church, the window with St. Richard on the right when you walk in, there's a chalice on the ground. And this is that story. Yes.
Yeah, so he supposedly knocks over the chalice, but the wine doesn't spill. It sort of sort of reverses itself. It's which I didn't think was a sort of one of those sort of magic sort of party tricks. So it was the blood of Christ was preserved from being despoiled, and this was obviously noticed by those around him. And likewise with the other miracle attributed to him in his lifetime of candles extinguishing, as also I forget the details, of sort of gust of wind blows in, all the candles are extinguished, but Richard's sort of come back, and he's alone, as a sort of sign, I guess, of his own holiness and or God's blessing and favour upon him. So those are the two which sort of have marked his own holiness in his own lifetime. I mean, I think like all the shrines that became important in the Middle Ages, it was healing which people received at these shrines, and miracles were reported of healing at his tomb from quite early on after his death, such that after he's canonized by the Pope, the cathedral eventually sets about building quite an elaborate shrine for him behind the high altar of the cathedral, which is where it now is. And it was one of the great pilgrimage destinations in the south of England, but very much secondary to Canterbury, but also a kind of key staging post for people who might have been travelling to Canterbury as well. So and Richard sort of in the shadow of Becket in some respects, as we discussed. But there also is, I mean, did read one too where I think it was a student at Oxford. I forget something about a bird, isn't it? Where Richard had a love of birds, and this bird is, I don't know, shot or strangled or something, and I think someone prays to St. Richard and who loved birds, and the bird immediately starts singing again. It's right, and it's sort of which he was obviously remained revered within Oxford, and no doubt amongst the Blackfriars at Oxford, and students who wanted to honour one of their own, in a sense, perhaps. But that's one of the slightly more fanciful ones. I mean, I don't think, how these things get written up in due course is a little bit debatable about, really. But I suppose the chalices and the candles are the ones which are most famously attributed to him.
Gotcha. Yeah, I actually, in thinking about that, I don't know how for seminarians, St. Richard is not more widely discussed, because who amongst us has not had a moment of terror when serving at the altar in seminary, right? And you knock the chalice and so I mean, every altar guild on earth, St. Richard, he's your guy, you know what I mean?
Yeah, pray earnestly for St. Richard.
Yeah, that's right. He'll protect the fair linen. Okay. Yes. So but I think that's kind of funny. Yeah, it's those two miracles are far more believable. I was hoping that St. Richard would have like a really crazy story. Like, is it St. Bridget that turned the bathtub into beer? Is that one of her famous?
Oh, I don't know that. Yes.
Okay, yes.
Bridget of Sweden or Kildare?
Kildare, yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, that there was like a bathtub, and she famously turned the dirty tub water into beer for the villagers. And that. Of course, that would be a miracle. Who wouldn't want to make you a saint? That was what you were able to do. And so, but I'm sure, Richard not spilling the blood of our Lord is also a holy thing. That's
interesting. The saints you therefore remembered there, Cameron.
I know. Well, yeah, maybe it says more about me. You're right. Fair point. I concede. Well, okay. So before we kind of move on, I want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time at the end for questions, and I do want to get to kind of what parts of St. Richard's legacy, you've touched on this a little bit as you've been telling about his life and things like that, but kind of what you think his witness has to say to us today. But before we move towards that, is there anything else that you would like to say maybe you didn't get around to about Richard's life or anything like that before we move on to talking about his witness and how it applies to us?
No, I don't. I don't think so. I mean, he I suppose it's worth saying that he dies whilst in Kent, where he's sort of given the duty of trying to raise cash for the Crusades. Mm-hmm. So he ends up dying in Dover.
So see, fundraising camptains just don't.
Yeah, exactly.
They'll kill you. They'll literally.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's probably worth noting. But so I mean, it's his words. He's living through all of that, and what that means on the ground in terms of parishes and raising the profile of recapture of Jerusalem and so on.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, in your estimation, because part of the reason that we still remember and venerate saints is not just for maybe miracles or things that they performed during their life, but also the way that their life and witness acts as an example for us, an inspiration for us on our own Christian journeys. And so maybe what are some things as you reflect that the witness of St. Richard might be an example of us for or inspire us to do in our own Christian lives today?
Yeah, it's I've been pondering the question. It's a good one, and I suppose we've been reaching towards him a bit and asking for his prayers at his shrine at the cathedral, I think, during this past year, where, as I say, we've already had to sort of think quite deeply about what it means to be a church at a time of crisis, and how do we renew people in the faith. And in that sense, he lived through a time of considerable political tension, but also a time of great struggle. Of course, it's a challenging time to be in ministry, and he embodies, I suppose, some of the key principles, as we discussed, of good Christian priestly presence. So there's something there about what he models, I suppose, for the clergy, about someone who is present to his people or her people, and shows love, but also the importance of spiritual discipline. Sort of speak up for canon law, perhaps, but it does make the point actually that canon law is there for a reason. It's not just to sort of keep the clergy in line; it's there for the whole people of God to grow in holiness and to be a vehicle for that. But I think there's something too about the Church of England. I don't know whether this is true of the Episcopal Church, but I think we sort of feel that the pandemic has accelerated all sorts of trends within the life of the church, and that, not that we've been acutely aware, of course, of the need to share the faith and to sort of be more engaged in the apostolic ministry of a diocese than perhaps we would have been 50 or 100 years ago. But I think there's something about Richard's desire to sort of step out of his comfort zone, which I think might be relevant for all of us, in fact. I mean, and not just the clergy, certainly. There's something, actually, there's a sort of spiritual truth there about, actually when your world is turned upside down, or actually all those things which you think might be due to you are denied you, in fact, that by the grace of God, in fact, these things can be an occasion of enormous grace and of renewal in trust in God and in his promises. And I think that's what you see in Richard's life, as a person who was not afraid to step out in faith, trusting in Christ. And obviously it shaped his own holiness and how people experienced his own ministry, but it renewed the life of the diocese in such a way that he's still revered to this day. in fact, the cathedral at the moment, so we're just about to explore a new vision for the whole place, but we're sort of setting it around the Dominican principles of study, of the four pillars, the so-called four pillars of the Dominican life, which are study, community, mission, and prayer, which perhaps ties in a bit to St. Richard's famous prayer, of course, about knowing, loving, and following Jesus, and that interconnection between a life of learning and what we're learning about God, about ourselves, about the truth about creation and the world and the whole universe. How does that relate to our own contemplation of God in prayer and going deeper into that relationship? And how does that, in its own way, resource a community which is full of joy, which is compassionate, which is inviting, and which is always seeking to serve those beyond its own community and its own walls through in the servant ministry of Jesus Christ. All these things are intimately related for the Dominicans, and I think they were for St. Richard as well. And I think that is where our hope lies in the future. It will be, just as the parish system took 300, 400 years to develop here, it's a long haul, and it's an investment of prayer and trust. Goodness me, I can't imagine that Richard in 1245 could ever have imagined that this conversation would be happening 800 years later, 900 years later, 800 years later. It's his, but it does speak to how mission and ministry in God's church is rooted in something which we can't always see, but which is there, and resourcing those who come after us as much as those who are present here now. So not to be fearful, I suppose, which goes back to our own Lord's words at the resurrection.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, which we are talking about this morning, and actually Mother Kelly's sermon talks a bit about in today's sermon. Yes. I'm struck with a couple of things. One, I think, yes, that what a good word, not to be fearful. And I think one of the great gifts and graces of the saints is the way in which it reminds us very powerfully, I think, that we don't do any of this Christian journey alone, right? And I don't just mean because, we're in a room right now, there are people in the room with me, there, whoever's joining us online. But yes, there's that immediate community. But that, again, like you said, would Richard could have even imagined that, 800 years later, we would be like, what is Texas? He would never have known, what is a Texas? Why is there a church there named after me? I don't know. And so it really, I think it draws into sharper focus that connection and that deep connection that we have with all of those who have gone before us, and on whose shoulders we all stand as we're going forward in this. And I think also just the fact that you and I are talking an ocean apart. I had to go to at least 2 different time zone websites to make sure that I wasn't going to give you the wrong time. And I think that's really profound, right? That we're linked together, not just by, the saints throughout time, but also it's what binds us together now, even across the world. So,
of course, that's such a fascinating, certainly something which I'm exploring here, really, which is how I engage in my ministry of teaching for the whole diocese on the internet. And I think that's something which Richard, as someone shaped by the Dominicans, would have absolutely loved. The possibilities made, it would saved him tramping around Sussex.
Sure, yeah.
But the possibilities of sharing the faith imaginatively and with beauty online and with joy, they're great. And that's one of the fascinating things here. I don't know whether that's true for all of you, but some of the statistics coming out from the Central Church, from Lambeth Palace, about how people have engaged with online worship and online faith resources has been absolutely astonishing. That how we live out our faith online is something which I think we've only really begun to explore properly.
Agreed. Yeah. We've been talking about that here, about how, even as we go back to more and more things in person, how do we continue to utilize the technologies that we have to continue to expand our offerings for formation and do things like this. I mean, this is really, really wonderful. Yeah, can you imagine St. Richard's admonishment on Facebook about the concubines? It would have gotten a lot of either dislike, angry face. Yeah. Oh, I can only imagine. Somebody earlier, I saw this on Twitter earlier in Lent. Somebody was talking about who would have been the most insufferable biblical social media user, and everyone agreed it was definitely going to be Paul, right? Like Paul would have been.
Yes.
Like, can you imagine? He wrote all those letters anyway. Can you imagine how he would have been? Like prolific poster. We would have all been spammed by St. Paul. Well, good. Well, in the remaining like 10 or so minutes we have, I'd love to open it up in here to the floor for questions. If anybody has any questions that came up, and if not, I might come up with one. Oh, okay. Was Richard ever married? Was that a thing that happened in the church? That the concubines may have happened, but not actual.
I don't think so.
Okay.
No, he was as all clergy were at that point celibate. Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and how did so do you want to know about the prayer specifically, or how did it become the song? Right. Yeah. So say a little more, if you could, about, I know you touched on the famous prayer attributed to him. And of course, it's been set to music, and both as a hymn, and then of course the famous the Godspell, rendition. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it's meant to be the prayer which he said on his deathbed, surrounded by his the clergy who had accompanied him on his preaching tour around Kent, and it's written up by his confessor, who I mentioned earlier on, but actually that sort of love more dearly, know more clearly, follow more nearly. Is that right? I was kind of had to question mark, got it right. But that I mean, it was his confessor writes it down in Latin, but it's his translator who definitely manages to kind of put it into a sort of rhyming, satisfying rhyming couplets, as it were, for the prayer itself. So it's, I mean, I think the sentiment is very much there in Richard's actual prayer, but of course it wouldn't have been quite as we say it now in that translation from. I'm not quite actually sure when the translation is sort of written down. It's sort of written within the Acts of the Saints, sort of medieval text, and then that's translated, I think, I want to say the 17th century after the Reformation. And then I think the song which Godspell uses actually comes from a hymnal, which I think that's 1930s, which is interesting that it happens at that time, because of course it's sort of arising out of a renewal of interest in the saints in the Anglican communion, arising out of the Oxford movement, and of course even the shrine here, I mean, that is kind of reinstated in 1930 in the cathedral, because of course it'd been ripped out by Thomas Cromwell in 1536, and all its beautiful ornaments removed, and so it's interesting that the hymn emerges about the same time that the shrine's established, and whether it was written for those who were being encouraged to visit on pilgrimage. It's a good question, and of course some of you have been here on pilgrimage, but there's a fascinating renewal of interest in pilgrimage in England and in Europe at the moment. I don't know whether that's true in the States too, but we've not us, but actually the British Pilgrimage Trust has developed all these amazing trails across England to cathedrals and to famous sacred sites, historic sacred sites, and now a bicycling pilgrimage, which I think is about to be launched next month. So it's interesting that even for those who are a bit more secular, the pilgrimage has a valency to it, which is appreciated. But
Yeah, we'll have to do that'll have to be a post-pandemic field trip. We're gonna have to come and make. But I did see the thing about the bike trail. That actually looks pretty neat. It links. If I correct me if I'm wrong, but it links every cathedral in England by bike trail. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes. Yeah. So
That's pretty
yeah,
cool.
I don't actually have a bike at the moment, so I was being encouraged to sort of spearhead it. I was like, oh, I don't actually have the means of doing so. But yeah, I think we've got
a professional justification for buying a bike, right? That's
yeah, I suppose so.
it's a ministry expense at this point.
Tax refundable. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Good. Well, any other questions? Yeah. Oh, yes. Okay. So what year did Richard die, and what did he die of?
Oh, that is a good question. It's 1253 that he dies. But I think he becomes ill, but I'm not sure that I know what he was ill with. I mean, it could be anything in medieval England, couldn't it? Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry. I should know that. He wasn't sort of stabbed by anyone. It was all. I think it was probably a nasty virus.
Yeah. It was more normal. There wasn't a good murder story to go along with it.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, Spencer.
Do you notice or do you sense some of that character of Richard in the congregation or the community, and kind of it feels like maybe he had like somewhat of an organic, natural ministry about it to the people. Do you notice some sort of sense or some inkling of that similar character within that area now, within your ministry now, within your
that's
you see little traces, if you will. And the other thing is there anything that survives Richard, like writings or anything else, anything that survives him now that we potentially could look up or read or
yeah. Okay. So this is a two-parter, but both are really good. So the first question is, is there kind of I'm going to sort of paraphrase what you said, and if it's not exactly right, let me know, Spencer. But basically, to what extent or how does Richard's life and example maybe infuse not just the ministry of the cathedral now, but also maybe in the diocese? Like, does he leave a legacy that way? And then the second part of the question is, does he leave a legacy in terms of writings or something like that we could actually look up and find and maybe read a digitized copy or something. So those are the two.
Yeah, good.
Does that sound right, Spencer? Okay, all right. I got a shrug. I'll go with it.
Okay. Yeah, well, the second question I think is pretty straightforward. No, there isn't a sort of unlike other saints of that period, or there aren't sort of he wasn't a sort of mystic who wrote down his own revelations, or even a sort of compendium of canon law, which might have been more up his street, to be honest, but or a sort of theological treatise. So there isn't anything of that kind. What we do know about him is preserved, as I say, by his confessor, really. I mean, I think there's some sort of bureaucratic evidence of his being in certain places and so on, and but nothing of substance to speak of. The first question is really good, but partly because the what do you call it? It's not slogan, but all deities now tend to have sort of rather wretched slogans to try and match their wretched strategies. But I don't know if that's true of the Episcopal Church. But ours is at least authentic because it is to know, love, follow Jesus. So I think that inheritance certainly shapes the diocese's own sense of what it means to engage in ministry, and I think that those three titles, three phrases, do resonate through diocesan decision making, and I think that's certainly true of the bishop. Who often thinks sort of does. You wonder to what degree he has this legacy of St. Richard in his head. He could only answer that himself. But someone who is very much for renewing the apostolic life of the diocese, and that's one of his key phrases, I suppose, and sharing in the apostolic ministry. And someone who is, well, he doesn't have a car, but he has a little bicycle, and and it's for environmental reasons, but he gads about at high speed all over the diocese, sort of leaping onto trains and then charging off on his little fold-up bike, which has a sort of perhaps a sort of resonance there with St. Richard. And I mean, and he's also going absolutely mad, I think it's fair to say, stuck in the palace for the past year, because he wants to be out and about in the parishes. So he's finding that very difficult. So I think there are some similarities there, along with a shared commitment to learning, I think, and the importance of theology for, and not just theology, which is sort of academic and sort of research level theology, but people having a real knowledge, understanding of their faith, and excited by it, wanting to share it. And I think that does filter through the diocese in all sorts of ways. I mean, I think it's so easy, isn't it, to sort of latch on to certain waves of either managerialism or aspects of the culture wars which come through, and to sort of make these our key defining principles. I suppose what Richard does is turn our faces towards Christ in a way which is very relatable. I mean, that's what's so wonderful about St. Richard's Prayer, isn't it? It works as a corporate level about who we are and who we wish to be and become, but it's very meaningful to each of us as individuals. It's a prayer which, I mean, I love saying. It kind of brings a focus to my own life, as much as it does, I imagine, for the whole diocese. But yeah, I mean, I think as a fairly new person to cathedral, I think we're only beginning to plumb the depths of that, really, and thinking, actually, what does it mean to become more contemplative? Not because it's so easy for cathedrals, I think, as big institutions which are big heritage attractions and tourist attractions, to be slightly seduced into the heritage industry. Sure. So to be able to sort of come back to say, actually, why are we here? Why is this building here? Why is it the widest nave? Well, because St. Richard built it. And why does St. Richard build it? It's those are the questions which you've got to go back to gain a sense of why you're doing what you're doing.
Well, that's really lovely. So we are at time, but I have one last question. I've got to let you get to tea, and I've got to go to church again. So one final question, and then we'll be done. And Father said we'll go with you.
The story of the contention between the king and the pope for the position of bishop and Chancellor. Richard was the voice of the pope. The king wanted Richard out of there. The king held the money rein, financial strength, and withdrew all compensation and monuments of office from Richard, in the hope that would cause him to move on. He refused. He chose to serve that people. The king took away all money for transportation. He had to walk from church to church in his diet. Paul refused to remove him.
Yes. So Father Sid here, who was actually the rector of the parish that took it from a mission to a parish. So it's not intimidating to have to preach in front of him every week as the rector now. But just gave a really wonderful sort of summation of what you described about Richard's tension between the Pope wanting Richard to be, that he was the Pope's man, but not the King's man. And the King sort of removed all of these, as you said, these sort of earthly benefits. But that actually those things ended up kind of forcing Richard into the sort of bishop that he became. He had to walk, from parish to parish and all of that, as you said. Yes. And I think that's that is both true and I think sometimes, or a beautiful picture of how sometimes the things which seem to be difficulties and hindrances to us actually open us up to maybe, again, new life or new ways of doing things that we wouldn't have done otherwise. So,
which says a lot about our current state, doesn't it? I think.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Well, yes. Hold on just one moment. So I do have what, sorry? Yes. Okay. So we have a number of people who would like to send condolences regarding the passing of Prince Philip this week. As Episcopalians, we are duty bound to pray for all of the dead, but certainly to to feel that.
That's much appreciated. Thank you.
Yes.
Confirming his understanding of that story. I think maybe.
Oh yeah. Yes. No. It's Father Sid. Yeah. Father Sid, you're exactly right. That's right. Yeah. You're exactly right. All of that is exactly how you described. So all right. Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, according to Tom Cooper, he checked 2 different sources, and even Wikipedia does not know how Richard died. So
okay.
if it's not on the internet, it doesn't exist, right? Anyway, well, on that note,
he did die on he did die on the 3rd of April, which is why I guess
yes.
That's why you celebrate him, and we celebrate him actually on the 16th of June, which is the anniversary of the translation of his relics to the shrine. So I wondered
why that date was different, actually, and so I'm glad you brought that up. Yes. Well, anyway, thank you all who are here joining us, whether you, again, were here in the parish hall or joining us online. We're so glad that you were here. And Dan, thank you sincerely for doing this. Yeah, thank you.
Delight to be with you. Yeah. God bless you all. Yeah.
Yes. So go forth. I hope you enjoy tea time, and I'm going to run and speedily vest.
I'll be betting upon your worship today. Good to be with you all.
Thank you. All right.
Take care of yourself.